And now, deep thoughts.
Whoa, that's pretty deep.
Hey, you're listening to Deep Thoughts, where every episode explores aspects of the Christian faith a little more deeply. I'm your host, Matt Shantz, and my guest in this episode is Sam Allberry. Sam is a pastor, an apologist, and he regularly speaks at conferences. And he's the co-host of a podcast with Ray Ortlund called You're Not Crazy: Gospel Sanity for Young Pastors. He's the author of a number of books, including What God Has to Say About Our Bodies and Why Does God Care Who I Sleep With? I'll chat with him in this episode about the 10th anniversary edition of his book, Is God Anti-Gay? And about a wonderful little book he wrote called 7 Myths About Singleness. I am so glad to have him on the podcast. So here's my deep conversation with Sam Allberry.
Everybody, deep thoughts starting.
Hi, Sam. Thanks for coming on my podcast.
It's good to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, a number of years ago, I was at a conference in Louisville. I think the locals call it Louisville, something like that. Louisville, Kentucky. And you were doing this preliminary conference thing there, and met you. And a younger version of me would have ran after you to chat with you. But I was like, that would be annoying. But appreciate you, Sam. Have for a long time, and somewhat regret not tracking you down.
That's okay. When you say younger version of me would have run, I was assuming you mean you're too old now just to physically cope with that.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't want to have the sore aches and pains. It wasn't worth it. No. Yeah. So thanks for coming on the podcast. I've read a bunch of your work and appreciate your voice in the landscape of Christianity. You tackle some challenging subjects, and you do it from a place of such honesty and transparency and biblical faithfulness. So as a pastor, you're a wonderful resource to me. And I know for our guests, they're really going to appreciate you as well. I'd love to we're going to talk about a couple of your books, Is God Anti-Gay? And 7 Myths About Singleness. But before we get there, just a couple things, lay of the land. Just what are you up to these days, Sam? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm moving to the States. In fact, I've just moved to the States as of last week. Having been back and forth a lot over the last 2 years, I'm waiting for a visa. I'm full-time in Nashville, Tennessee, based at Emmanuel Church in Nashville. So that's what I'm up to now. Very excited to be there. It's been a church I've loved and have been around as long as as much as I was allowed to be pre-visa over the last few years. So
okay,
that's life for me now. So a mixture of pastoral ministry at the church, writing, speaking, doing other things as well.
And how did you get into ministry? Did you start in the Anglican Church or the Church of England? Or
I did, yeah. Okay. So I was converted through an Anglican church in England, and soon after I became a Christian, I felt the Lord leading me into pastoral ministry, and the only church I knew was the Church of England. So I applied and was ordained in the Church of England. So it was the first 10 or so years of my ministry life, 20 years nearly now, was served in Church of England parishes.
And now Emmanuel is Presbyterian, is that right?
No, Emmanuel is independent.
It is, okay.
It's an independent church. So yeah, it's the first church I've been at that isn't sort of part of a kind of denomination, which has positives and negatives to it.
What's the biggest change?
I guess it's that sort of, there's no fixed, this is how we do things around here because we are capital P Presbyterian, or we're Baptist, or we're Anglican, and this is the way you do it, church, if you're an Anglican. It's a nice, I mean this in a flattering way. It's a kind of Frankenstein's monster of the good bits of lots of other traditions, kind of stuck together. So that's quite fun. So yeah, I'm enjoying that.
Did Ray Ortlund plant Emmanuel, or was it an existing church?
No, he planted it. So yeah, he planted it in 2008. So we're 15 years old, and that's weird for me too. Having been in Church of England parishes back in the UK, The last church I was at was founded in the 13th century. The church before that was well over 1,000 years old. And so it still slightly freaks me out when someone comes up to me at church and says that they are one of the founding members, because that's just, I've not had that category before.
Yeah. If a church was from the 1600s, it was a new church in your previous context.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So 15 years old feels like it's a kind of still very much an infant. But
is Ray Ortlund the kindest human you've ever met, or what? He seems like the most wonderful, fatherly man who's ever lived. True? False? What's the deal?
Almost true. I would say his wife is the kindest person I've ever met. And Ray is possibly the second kindest person I've ever met. And he would not argue with that.
Nice.
No, he's a dear man. He's such a delight to know. It's his full-time in Nashville. I met and got to know Ray several years ago, and he had me come and preach at the church. And the first time I went there, I just thought, oh, wow, this is different. This is a kind of church I just had a profound sense of feeling at home there. So Ray was the one who first sowed the seed of, why don't you come and be based here and join the church and join the staff team? So now that I've actually done that, I'm sure he's thinking, I was only joking, Sam, come on. This is you weren't actually meant to do it.
Yeah.
But no, it's lovely. I saw him just a couple of days ago, and he's nuclear powered encouragement. It's just wonderful.
Yeah, I had his son Gavin on the podcast a year or two ago, and it runs in the family, and so they've done a good job there. But Ray, there's something about, and I see his ministry from afar, you see it up close, but it's a breath of fresh air to hear that there's a pastoral warmth to him. Doesn't mean that he doesn't share biblical truths and so that are sometimes challenging or whatever, but there is this pastoral warmth to him that is so wonderful. And I see that in your ministry as well, Sam. There's a warmth, a winsomeness to it. I really appreciate. So I've listened to a number of episodes from the podcast you two do together, You're Not Crazy, and it's especially for pastors, and you do such a great job of encouraging pastors there. How did that come about? And just tell us a little bit about this concept of You're Not Crazy, because personally, I really like it.
Yeah, so the genesis is that the Gospel Coalition, some time ago, knowing that Ray was soon to be stepping back from being the lead pastor and, retiring from that role, certainly not from pastoral ministry, they asked him if he would do a podcast principally aimed at younger pastors. And this was probably back in 2017, 2018, they first asked him to do this. Ray was too busy wrapping things up at Emmanuel to sort of get around to anything quickly. But as he began to think about it, he asked him if I could do it with him, partly because the very kinds of things Ray was wanting to talk about in that podcast, what we've called gospel culture, is best shown through friendship rather than just through a monologue. And we thought it would more naturally lend itself to a conversational, chatty, back and forth. It's such a relational concept. It's a hard thing to talk about outside of relationship. And he and I, we just have these conversations all the time anyway. So in one sense, occasionally someone will switch on a microphone and record the conversation, but we have these kinds of chats all the time. And occasionally I'll be sat down and we'll both be chatting, and I'll get to the end of the conversation. I'll be like, Ray, that would have been a good episode. We should have, we should have saved that. So that's kind of how that's come about. It's aimed at young pastors. That we've since realised that the vast majority of our leaders are neither pastors, and in some cases wouldn't call themselves young either. It really is for anyone who wants to help promote a healthy culture in their church. And I hope that the value of non-pastors listening to it is it gives them ways in which they can pray for their pastors, cheer on their pastors, encourage their pastors. And the reason it's called You're Not Crazy is because those are the three most healing words you can hear. If you're in a church context where things on paper are very orthodox,
Mm-hmm.
and the doctrine is all very, very sound and correct, and yet it's not a place where anyone ever feels safe, to be honest. It's not a place where you would come to if you were in trouble. It's not a place you feel relieved to walk into on a Sunday morning. Then our message is, you're not crazy. It's not supposed to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really the reason for it, and hence the subtitle is Gospel Sanity. For our church, is trying to make sure we just keep gospel not just in the content of the sermon, but in the vibe and feel and all the intangibles of church life as well.
Mm. Well, I'm super thankful for it. I'm not sure I would qualify myself as a young pastor anymore either. I hit 40 in the summer, and evidently I'm not running.
We decided
I'm not running to people as much anymore.
We decided anyone who's younger than Ray is
okay,
young.
awesome.
So that's the benchmark.
There you go. Okay, great. So this is new news, but you have just been recently named a fellow of the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. That's got to be an honor to have your name connected to Tim Keller. Is in the evangelical or Protestant world. Phenomenal. Well, I shouldn't say that in certain streams, I guess, but I adore him. I adore him. And I just love
do I.
Yeah. And I'd love to just hear.
My roommate has this beautiful golden retriever puppy that he's called Keller. So
nice.
There's another sweet Keller in my life.
Yeah. Is that an honor? I don't know.
I don't know. He's such a cute dog that I think if Tim saw him, he would realize that's a high honor.
Okay.
But no, I'm thrilled to be part of that. I look at all the other people who are part of it and realize who was, I wonder who was asleep at the switch when I got let in. But I think it would be a wonderful group of people to be picking the brains of. Mm-hmm. Bouncing ideas around. Some of them I know already. You mentioned Gavin earlier. There's a few others that I would count as very dear friends indeed, and others that I'm looking forward to getting to know better. But the spirit of the group has been sweet from the very beginning. We only were up and running about 3 weeks ago. We've got a Slack channel, and one of the first things that happens was someone asking for prayer. And saying, I'm really struggling with this at the moment. Someone else saying, well, people were confessing sins and sharing struggles and asking for prayer from the very beginning, which made me think, okay, this is going to be real. This isn't going to be playing at apologetics and in the sense of trying to look like we're the finished product and have got everything together. We're going to be real with each other, which will actually mean we can begin to think about actually engaging this culture. We're not going to get far with the culture we're in right now. We're not going to get very far with it without being vulnerable and open. Yep. So to see that already happening within the team has been a real blessing.
What is cultural apologetics? How does it differ from, what we normally think about when we hear the word apologetics and more traditional apologetics? What is the aim of the Keller Center in terms of cultural apologetics?
Yeah, I should probably know the answer to that. I actually there's a book on my shelf I've read called Cultural Apologetics, I have such a bad memory. So ask any of the other 25 fellows and they will give you a succinct, learned answer. But I think it's that idea of not merely scolding our culture and wagging our fingers at our culture, but actually thinking, let's try and understand, what are people wanting? What are people trying to be doing in our culture? What are the aspirations and hopes that we see in the light of the gospel are misdirected and, they've got the wrong end of the stick on certain things, but how can we use some of those cultural yearnings and say, actually, the gospel is you want unity, you want diversity, you want authenticity. Those are understandable goals to have, but here's what you've not realized about them, and here's how we find the true version of those things in Jesus. Yeah. So it's and it's named after Keller, not because we're all going to try and be Tim Keller. Only one person can be Tim Keller. But because that's a good method, and we want to sort of continue that posture. There's a kind of Christian jujitsu Tim does with non-Christian arguments, where he takes the emotional force of them and uses that very emotional force to point the person to Christ. My understanding is that that's the kind of thing we're talking about here. We're not saying there's no room for any other apologetics. There is, but this is one of the things we particularly want to sharpen each other up on. Yeah,
that's well said. Yeah, Keller is a black belt. If that's that's great. It's been put recently, the yearnings of the modern heart today is not so much is Christianity true, but is Christianity beautiful? And so picking up on story and values, like you said, of generally in our culture today, and showing actually Christianity, doing the Keller Jiu-Jitsu, as you will, to kind of show how Christianity fulfills those deepest longings. That's well said. I like that. Well, it's been 10 years since, so talk about feeling like we're getting old. It's been 10 years since your book, Is God Anti-Gay, came out, and which is wild. Like, time flies. I remember reading that when it was a fresh new book. And I've been recommending it ever since. It's been a helpful resource. And now there's a revised and expanded 10th anniversary edition. What's changed in the landscape in the last 10 years since writing the book? And therefore, how have you adapted the book?
Yeah, a lot has changed. Actually, you just alluded to one of those changes. When I first wrote that book in late 2012, early 2013, the big question was, does the Bible really say this about sexual ethics? And so the first part of that book was going through the relevant biblical passages, showing how they hadn't been misunderstood. Whereas today the question is, how can a Jesus who constrains my sexual expression possibly be good?
Yes.
And so I front-loaded the book looking at Jesus and his goodness. And the stuff on the Bible text is still there, but I shoved it at the back because it's just less urgent. It still needs to be there, but it's not among the top 5 questions I'm being asked these days. So I'm really leaning into the goodness of Jesus, given what he says about human sexuality. And I've also realized that some of the language I used in 2013 was fine then, but it feels more loaded now in different ways. And I don't want to cause unnecessary offense. And a lot of people, I hadn't particularly written the book with the aim of it being given to those who aren't believers, but a lot of people have used the book with their non-Christian friends. So I've tried to make the new edition much more accessible to those who would be outsiders. It's not assuming you know any particular Christian terminology or background beliefs or anything like that. So it's been restructured. That the tone has changed at a few points. I've taken out bits that just didn't feel like they were anything anyone was asking about anymore.
Right. Okay.
And added some things that feel more urgent to the cultural time that we're in. 2013 was such a long time ago. I mean, it was 10 years in terms of chronology, but an eon ago in terms of where culture was at. Gay marriage wasn't a legal reality in the UK or the US. And even saying that feels like we're talking a really long time ago.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad there is that adapted, expanded edition, and appreciate that you are bringing, it's getting kind of another publishing, and that is great. It's been such a help. When we talk about that question, is God anti-gay? The prevailing wisdom of the day would seem to answer with resounding yes. Yes, he is. And so I guess, how is it that the historic Christian sexual ethic isn't God hates gay people, or at the very least, Christians' view of homosexuality as a sin is synonymous with hate? How do you, I know that that's where the book goes at points, but how do you respond to those? Those are the social norms. That's the sense, right? God hates gay people, or Christians' view is itself hate.
Yeah. I think that the best response is to show how the gospel so clearly puts all of us in the same boat.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone says to me, are gay people going to hell? My answer is, if there's no hope for gay people, there's no hope for anyone. Because we're all sexual sinners. We're all fallen and broken in this part of life. And if there's a type of sexual sin that Jesus isn't good news for, he's not good news for any of us.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to take the focus off the gayness of the particular sin in question and say, well, actually, this is true of all of us. This is true of all of our sin. And part of the need to do that, by the way, is because over the past decades, for some reason, the evangelical church has taken the sin of homosexuality and has kind of made it a species of its own, which has meant that we've then not known what to do with it. And the kind of gospel common sense we would instinctively bring to other discussions and other areas of life, for some reason, we've lost that when it comes to this sin. And we think it's a different kind of issue. It's a different kind of person. There must be a different set of protocols that need to be kind of observed when it comes to discussing it and responding to it. So really all I'm trying to do is the very unsophisticated task of putting this discussion back in a normal gospel framework.
Yes. And
saying that let's just remember what the gospel does with any sin, and let's have the gospel do that with this one too.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. You mentioned earlier, just with revising the edition of the book, that some of the things written there weren't the five, big questions you were being asked all the time. What are a couple of the biggest questions that you're confronted with about this? Yeah,
the big thing is, it's not really a question. It's just an accusation. The Christian view of sexuality is harmful.
Mm-hmm.
That's the big issue. I hear that far more than I hear anything else. At its strongest form, it takes the form of, you are the reason gay teenagers are committing suicide.
Mm.
You're the reason there's all these mental health issues amongst LGBT people. So I want to take that question seriously. It is a serious question. So that's one of the big ones. The whole issue of how can you be someone's friend if you don't affirm them? That's become a bigger deal now. What do you do about someone inviting you to a same-sex wedding, for example? How do we be grace and truth at the same time to our friends on this kind of stuff? So I think those tend to be the big questions now. And hasn't the church already proved it has such a bad track record at getting things right that why on earth should we listen to you now?
Yeah.
That would be one. I think I've just thought of that one since the book came out, so I have to do another edition.
The 25th.
But those are the kinds of things that people. I'm certainly hearing far more these days.
Can you just drill down a little bit? I know that these are big concepts and huge conversations and require a lot of care, but you've raised them, and some of the listeners are like, what do I do when those sorts of accusations or questions and concerns are brought about? What does grace and truth look like in this conversation?
Yeah, the very short answer is it looks like Jesus. Mm-hmm. You think of Jesus eating with Levi and Levi's friends, and being called the friend of sinners as a result. I love that was his, that was seen as an insult.
Yeah, right.
For him. Jesus could be someone who others clearly were drawn to and comfortable being around. He was able to not be approving and joining in with what people were doing. He could disagree with them without rejecting them. And he could receive people without affirming everything.
Mm-hmm.
And we've almost lost the kind of, that's just not part of our cultural grammar now. We assume love equals affirmation, and lack of affirmation must mean enmity and hate. And Jesus' physical presence at the table with tax collectors and sinners shows us that is not the case. Jesus did not sin with sinners. He didn't excuse sin or wink at it, but he didn't just push people away either. And there was something about Jesus that people evidently felt they liked having him around. So that's the vision for us. That's the calling for us to try to express and reflect and embody to people the heart of Christ. So when it comes to particular questions about how we respond to certain situations, certain conversations, for me, the driving kind of principle is I always want someone to know how much Jesus means to me. And I also want them to know how much they mean to me. Yeah. And if I can be conveying both of those things at the same time, then I can be sure I'm doing the right thing. Whether that's through attending a ceremony or not attending a ceremony or whatever it is, if our going or not going can let them know how much Christ means to us and how much they mean to us, then we're doing the right thing. Because it's the way we do it more than what we do that is going to be significant here.
Yeah, well said. Well, for you, your same-sex attraction and holding of a Christian sexual ethic have led you to be a single celibate man, which, like with your Is God Anti-Gay book, has made you such a credible and helpful voice on the subject also of singleness. So I've done a couple sermons on singleness over the years, and I found your book, 7 Myths About Singleness. I found it so helpful. And every time I've spoken on singleness, every time I've had singles come up to me and say, I've been in the church for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years and never heard a sermon on singleness, which means I guess they were never in a church that went through 1 Corinthians 7 at some point, or I don't know. But right, it's there. It's in multiple places in the life of Jesus, all that kind of stuff. But I hear that all the time. And I'm just wondering for you, that being your experience, how easily did the 7 myths come to you when you wrote the book? Were they just all like there? Like, I can just sketch these out because I come across these all the time. I live with this. Or did it take a little bit of work?
They did come fairly quickly. As I began to do more and more talks about sexuality, and therefore the issue of singleness is always going to be coming up in that conversation in one way or another. One of those common pieces of feedback I would hear from people was, oh, I'm not same-sex attracted, but you've really helped me think through singleness in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. And so I started to think, okay, that seems to be gaining traction. I wonder why. And then thinking, okay, there must be something we're generally not being attentive to that that the Bible can help us with here. I remember doing a breakout at a Gospel Coalition conference a few years ago, and I just called it Misconceptions About Singleness and came up with, I think, 4 or 5 just for the purposes of that session. And then when I started to work on the book, I broke one of those misconceptions into 2 because it always felt like there were 2 different parts to it, that of intimacy and that of family. And then wanted to use the last myth to come clean about some of the painful things about being single. So that the myth that singleness is easy, because I hadn't sort of addressed that side of it in talks. And I felt in a book, I really ought to show the whole story and where it's, what it's like when it's difficult, how that's been the case for me, which meant that it's probably been the most personal book I've written. Because I felt like there was quite a lot of, whether overtly or covertly, there was a lot of autobiography in it. It was me processing a lot of things by writing on it. So yeah, that's how that came about.
How do you hear, and from your own experience as well, but hearing it from others, how do you hear and this is helpful for the church in general to hear, how do you hear and experience being a single person in a local church setting? For example, here in my church, we've got a ton of young families. And it's we like to have kids be able to worship Jesus with their mom and dad for the first part of the service before going to their own kids ministry partway through. So there's like this flood of kids that go out during the service. Yep. And we always make, it's like, oh, it's a beautiful sight. It's wonderful. And if we're not careful, we're constantly talking about the kids and the families, or can generically talk about almost as if it's a given that everybody's got a spouse and kids, And so there's some folks who are married but aren't able to have kids. There's some folks who are single. There's some folks who, all sorts of different dynamics. So we try to get away from some of that stuff. But what have you heard? Like, what are a lot of the typical experiences of single folks in our local churches?
Yeah, you've hit on some of them there. The church I've come from in England was a very similar church to yours. It was a kind of place, but there was a great place to move out to when you were moving out of London, and this is where you go to have kids and raise kids. So the church was bursting at the seams with new parents, with young families. So I can well imagine, and again, the kids would be dismissed partway through the service, and you suddenly feel like there was tumbleweed, and half the building was emptied out. But you're right. But without even thinking about it, the language and posture can make it sound like that's the expectation. So the fact that you're even asking the question is a sign that you've not fallen into the kind of trap of being oblivious to that. But it's little things, actually, and life is often a sum of trivialities, and so these little things cumulatively make a big difference. But it's not just saying, now's the point where our kids go, but now is the point in the service where if you have children, we would like to dismiss them to the class. So there's just a slight qualifier there that we're not assuming, oh, well, we all have kids and this is the point where all of our kids go now. One of the things I would feed back to my colleagues who were pastors there alongside me was, be wise about when and how you use your own marriage and children in a sermon illustration. It's not saying don't do that, or an application. Don't speak as if everyone's married. So the application is all of us need to be better at this with our spouse. But again, to say, actually for me as a married person, this is how it lands on me. I was talking to someone this week at the church who's single, and they were saying this is how that challenges them. So there's a sort of giving visibility to the non-married and non with kids people in the church, I think, is very significant without overdoing it. The other thing was, and this may just be the church culture I've come from in the UK, whenever someone would ask a pastor, "How's your church going?" The typical metric was how many young families are joining.
Interesting. So
I remember hearing someone who had just planted a church in a town where starting from scratch. And so it's been great because we've had some families join us, as if the basic unit of church life is the family. Mm-hmm. And then if you get anyone else in there, a bonus, I suppose. But it sort of really felt like you need families to make a church. Which again just makes you feel as a single person slightly superfluous and as though not unwelcome, but just it's the families that really matter, and the rest of us have to fit in around the families. And everything in the church,
right?
Yeah, everything in the church revolves around the kids.
Right.
So we don't do that this week because the kids are off school. So it's not good for families. That's an important factor for things, but it shouldn't be the determining factor for everything.
Right. Yeah.
Because again, it can make it feel as though we're all really just here for the kids and for the parents. One of my responsibilities at my previous church was to oversee the small groups. And again, one of the dynamics I observed frequently was people saying, "I want to join a small group, but can we be in a group with other young parents?" And I'd always say, well, statistically, that's very likely anyway, just because of the demographics of the church. But I always try to say to them that it's understandable you want to be in, fellowship with people who are at a similar stage of life to you. You can compare notes and that kind of thing. But I said, actually, you really need to be in a group with some people who are empty nesters, because they've been there and done that and come out the other end and are still approximately sane. Trying to show people how much we need the people who are not like us.
Yes.
To enrich our fellowship. Otherwise, we're just multiplying our own blind spots and doubling up on them. So that's another factor too.
That's a great insight. Yeah, agreed. So true. Theologically speaking, the beginning of the Bible, God makes man, he's alone, and even before the fall, God's like, that's not good. And so he creates a woman, a helper fit for him, it says. And so there's this idea, this concept of like, that's held up as the ideal, I guess you could say. I'm just wondering how you might speak to singleness as a good in itself, and then how this idea of not good to be alone applies to singleness in terms of intimacy and relationship. That's obviously vital. We see that in the creation movement there itself. Would love to hear you kind of interact with that a little bit theologically as it pertains to singleness.
Yeah, it's a really big question, because you can read that text and think, well, you need marriage in order to not be inadequate. What it means is that Adam on his own is not sufficient to do the things God has given him to do. It's not just that he needs a kind of a soulmate, but he needs a helper, not just it's cast in those terms more than it's cast in, romantic terms. And marriage is not the only solution to the issue of we're not good on our own. It's one of the main ones, but we see throughout the rest of the Bible actually that the community of the people of God is meant to be that answer as well. And it's true, we're not good on our own. We're designed for healthy community and relationship. So it's not an argument against singleness, it's an argument against isolation. And I know married couples who have really struggled because of a lack of friendship. Married people need friendship too. So, and if we look into the dynamics of the age to come, we won't have marriage in the age to come. But we will have community, we will have friendship. In the new creation, it will also not be good for man to be alone, but there won't be marriage. So in the perfected order of things, none of our not aloneness will be through marriage and romance. And so those things we can enjoy now as good gifts of God, not as ultimate things in themselves, and to make sure all of us, whatever our marital status, that we're leaning into the gift of friendship.
That's good. And then later in the Bible, 1 Corinthians 7, Paul's like, if you burn with passion, go and get married. But I wish that kind of all of you were like I am. And essentially he's saying like single, like me. Yeah. And then he goes on to talk about the usefulness that can be for ministry. But we always need to remember what you just said, that we're made for relationship. We need friendship. But can you speak to that as well? Because we do often treat, and it was just practically speaking in a local church, you kind of drew that out earlier, when it's said that way, it kind of makes singles feel like second-rate citizens here. The Apostle Paul almost seems to elevate the other way and go, this might be the greatest ideal. So how do those mesh, or how would you unpack that 1 Corinthians 7 speech of Paul there?
Yeah, he's speaking in a very particular context. He's not making a global statement about singleness being always better than married life in every respect for every person. He's saying there's a particular aspect of life where being single is better. There are ways, our devotion to the Lord is such that singleness can really help, because you're being pulled in fewer directions. You have fewer of those worldly kind of entanglements. And he's, we stop and think about it. It's manifestly true. You look at how long it took me to leave the house this morning, compare it to someone who's got 4 young kids trying to get them out of the house. There are some ways in which it is easier to be single, and we can be available to the Lord in a way that we couldn't be if we were married. And that's not to say marriage is less spiritual. And the same Paul, who wrote 1 Corinthians 7, wrote Ephesians 5 and gave us glorious, exalted teaching about what marriage is like and how it points to Christ in the church. So I think at its healthiest, the church doesn't sort of pit one of those things against the other, but celebrates and honors both. There are unique blessings to being single, and there are unique blessings to being married. And we need to affirm that in both cases.
Well, as we land the plane here, just two final questions. I'm wondering if you can just share on them pastorally here. Just a word that you would give to the church about singleness, and then a word to singles themselves who would be listening, a word of encouragement and comfort to them.
To the church, I would say it's in everyone's interests to have understood singleness and to be making sure the singles in our churches are thriving. We all need to understand it, because this is an uncomfortable thing to think about, but over half of the people who are presently married will be single again, whether through divorce or bereavement. And given that, it's better to think about the singleness you will find yourself back into at some point before better to have got your head around that before you find yourself plunged through grief or pain into it. So we all need to understand this. We all have a stake because the church is a body, and if the singles aren't flourishing, the whole body will hurt. Just as I have a stake in that the marriages in my church being healthy. To the singles, I would say try not to there's so many different needs amongst those who are single. Being single in your 20s is vastly different to being single in your 50s. But I just want people to know that it can feel, because of our culture, as though your marital status is the key determiner of what the rest of your life is going to be like and how happy the rest of your life could be. And I'd want to just gently say that that's really not the case. It's your position in Christ that is the key thing. And the more you cherish Christ, just the less it will matter to you whether you end up married or single. It'll just be less of a big deal. You may still want to be married. That's a godly thing to desire. You may love being single. That's a wonderful place to be as well. But hopefully, in both cases, it'll just matter less, because ultimately we have all that we need in Jesus. And marriage and singleness become good gifts from the Lord, but neither of them is the be-all and end-all.
Well said. Well, I appreciate you so much, Sam. So this has been a treat for me to get to chat with you. I'm thankful for your ministry, your work. And just as a side note, it's neat to hear that you've just moved to the States from England, because the next natural move would be to move up to Canada, because it's Commonwealth. You're in North America. You're inching closer. We'll get you up here eventually. But thanks so much, Sam. Appreciate you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, Sam is such a unique and winsome voice on a number of important and often sensitive subjects. I commend his work to you, and I just really hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. A YouTube video version of the podcast is in the works. If you're watching this, it's happened. If you're listening to it, just know it's available on YouTube soon. And as always, your help getting the podcast out there is always appreciated. You can do that by leaving an honest 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, by sharing content on social media, and sending episodes to people in your life who you think will be helped by it. Thanks for listening to Deep Thoughts. I hope it helps you in fostering deep faith. Are you standing right now?
I am, yeah. There is literally no chair here. So
That's great.